But that's the kind of thing we have to think about, although hopefully not directed towards war. But I have to say, since you clearly, I mean, I appreciate your having me, but it sounds like you're more on the right of the political spectrum. It is the free market, the unrestrained free market, that has gotten us where we are today.
Well, yes and no. I agree with you with the financial world, and I totally agree we need to put some type of kibosh on all of the activity that actually built up a market that wasn't even supposed to be there from the beginning. As we know, it collapsed, and there really wasn't business to be had. It was like false business that was being created. I totally did not agree with the subprime push that, by the way, you know, President Clinton, who is a Democrat, was the one who pushed into effect, and he also overturned and deregulated the financial industry. So when you tell me that I'm on the right side of the spectrum, it is your Democrat who actually put us where we are.
It has the general deregulation, orientation toward the free market, and low interest rates as the solution to everything. That has been a bipartisan effort for at least the last 20 years. I agree with that completely.
Well, the financial deregulation going into law was signed by Bill Clinton's pen.
Some of it was. Some of it had already started. But no, you're quite right. He didn't do anything to reverse the trend, and I think that's very sad.
Right. Well, let's talk to, I know we want to move on to Afghanistan for the moment. Let's talk about that. President Hamid Karzai seems to be losing touch with his mission and his allies. Can you talk about the recent time he was being briefed about the Taliban attacks? You did mention this on your website. It was actually pretty surprising.
Well, the trouble is, more broadly, and we've run into this before, I wrote a book about this in Vietnam, we decide that country X is very important to us, and we seize upon someone who has some kind of political base who we think will work for the same objectives that we want, such as Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam, or this time Hamid Karzai. And then the longer it goes on, the more it becomes quite clear that actually they don't have the same objectives that we have at all. And Hamid Karzai is not interested in an all-out war against the Taliban, waged mainly by American forces.
Why so? Or why not?
Well, I think he thinks, first of all, that the Taliban is too big, that there's going to have to be some role for them, and he thinks that it's going to be too destructive, and he's right about that. And he's also apparently, well, no, he is not. I mean, our own ambassador said this, as we know. He's not interested in having a corruption-free government or a Western-style democracy or any of those things. And as has happened so many times in the past, we have to be realistic about two things. First of all, what our actual interests in Afghanistan are, and secondly, what the actual political possibilities in Afghanistan are. And this Western-style democracy that we are after, in my opinion, is not one of them.
Have we actually defined what we're looking to get out of Afghanistan? Is it just stability?
Well, it is stability, and we have decided that because the Taliban in Afghanistan more than 10 years ago sheltered Al-Qaeda, that we cannot afford to have them back in. Now, I honestly don't know if that is true or not. Al-Qaeda, in some ways, is what we call a very cooperative adversary. That is, they are their own worst enemy, and they have never been able to get along with anybody for very long on their own side. And they have made themselves far more friends than enemies anywhere they've had power. And that was already happening in Afghanistan at the time of 9/11. And in fact, there's some evidence that Al-Qaeda was already trying to force the Taliban into more of a confrontation with the West to make them more reliable friends. So as to whether the Taliban in Afghanistan would let Al-Qaeda back into Afghanistan, I'm not at all sure that that's true. And the Taliban is not an international jihadist movement. The Taliban is a local, ethnic, religious fundamentalist movement among Pashtuns, mainly in Afghanistan. And frankly, it is not clear to me that it is really a serious threat to the United States if they were gain control over some of Afghanistan, and almost nobody thinks they could ever gain control of all of Afghanistan. And there are probably a lot more important things for us to worry about and spend our money on than that. And I do think that slowly but surely, I mean that incident, yes, Karzai was being briefed about an attack that the Taliban had made, and he suddenly said, "Oh, I don't think the Taliban made that attack. That was probably made by the United States," which was just his way of saying, I don't want to hear about this.
And it was extremely ludicrous to even suggest.
Well, it is, but it does show, and there have been several other recent incidents, including his statement that he might have to join the Taliban,
right,
to show that he does not have the same objectives we do, and there's no point in kidding ourselves about that.
So what's the solution here? You got to get Karzai out, or you got to just hold your firm ground?
Well, the other
say,
huge problem, which is finally emerging in the press, although I've been hearing about this for years, is that important elements of the Pakistani government have always wanted the Taliban in power in Afghanistan and still do. Now, they're not so happy about the Taliban within Pakistan, which is turning on them. But they regarded the Taliban as an asset, and they still do, and that's a huge problem. Now, I'm not...
Why are they an asset? Just because...
I beg your pardon?
Why is the Taliban an asset?
It's an asset to Pakistan because they think they will keep India out of Afghanistan.
Okay.
Now, let's see. And Pakistan is clearly not happy with our presence in Afghanistan, and I don't think they're happy about the drone strikes. I'm not the sort of person who becomes Secretary of State, but if I were, I would be very tempted to go to Afghanistan and tell their government, look, we understand how you feel. We're not really very interested in Afghanistan. We just as soon get out of it. But there's something you have to do for us, which is to produce Osama bin Laden. And if you can do that, then all this will look very different.
Interesting. Very quickly, we need to move on to our next guest. But you have a solution for BP that I read on your blog. That was very interesting. You ran into somebody who maintains oil rigs for his job, right? Not
oil rigs, but he is involved in the oil business. He maintains oil storage tanks.
Oil storage tanks.
Now, unfortunately, it turns out that what he said is not quite right.
Oh.
What he said, I emailed you about this earlier tonight because I researched it a little bit more. He said that in Canada, it turns out that if you have a blowout in an offshore rig, like they've had in a leak, we're finding this out for the second time. The only thing that really works is to drill what is called a relief well, which allows you to get inside the well below where it's coming out and seal it off. And they're working on that now, but it's going to take 5 or 6 months, or at least 3 or 4 months. And that's what happened in the big spill off of Mexico in the late 70s, where actually Rachel Maddow did a great piece on this with clips from the news at the time. They tried every single thing that we've watched them try in the Gulf, and none of it worked. And then finally, 4 months later or whatever, the relief well was in and it was capped. Now, in Canada, my original thing, I've not corrected it on the blog, but that my friend said was, you had to have the relief well drilled at the time that you drilled the original well, which is a great idea, obviously. It turns out the Canadian regulation is not that strict, but you have to satisfy the authorities in Canada that you can drill a relief well within a relatively short period of time.
And what is a short period of time? 5 months?
By the end of the season in the Arctic. In other words, before it freezes.
Okay.
And actually, NPR did a feature about this, which is where I got the real story. And it turns out that BP, just in the last year, was trying to get the Canadian government to waive that requirement. But why don't we, here's another job creation idea. Why don't we tell every offshore driller off the shores of the United States right now, we're not going to wait for this to happen again. You've got to get a relief well in place, or at least halfway in place, right now.
I agree. I think that's a wonderful solution. It puts some people to work. Yep, it might actually cost a little bit more for these companies, but they've got the money. They should be taking proactive measures because I'm tired of being reactive in this country.
Exactly.
All right.
I'm delighted to end on a point of agreement. Don't hesitate to call me again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David Kaiser. What is the website where people can find you?
HistoryUnfolding.com.
All right. Wonderful to have you on the show. Thanks a lot, David.
Thank you.
All right.